My name is Carter. Just Carter. No last name that matters. I've been a trucker since before I learned to distrust the silence, and a hillbilly since forever. The kind who knows the smell of rain before it falls and can tell when a road doesn't want to be crossed. I am the teller of dark stories, not by choice. A dark story doesn't choose its narrator. It sticks. It lingers. It crawls into your ear while the engine roars and only leaves once it's been told. I've heard plenty of good things in this life. AM radio tunes, laughter at gas stations, the promise of the big city. But what truly stays is what nobody wants to hear. This story began on a route that no longer appears on maps. A forgotten stretch between two rural states where the asphalt is too old to remember who laid it and too new to look like a ruin. I was driving in the dead of night, as I always do when I want to avoid people and find truths. The truck was hauling timber, trees cut down far from there, but still smelling of a living forest. That detail matters. It always matters. Around 3 in the morning, I saw a house. Not the kind of house that gradually emerges on the horizon. It was just there, by the roadside. Light on, narrow porch, a rocking chair moving all by itself. I didn't stop. I learned early on that the road teaches you, but it charges a high price when you answer too quickly. I kept driving, except a few miles later, I saw the same house again. Same light, same chair, same bad feeling settling into the passenger seat. It wasn't fear, it was recognition, as if something were happy I had returned, even without turning back. That's why I tell stories, because some things happen only once. Others, they keep happening until you accept that you won't escape by carrying it all alone. And if you're listening to this now, it's not out of curiosity. It's because this road passes through you too, and it already knows your name. The story I'm about to tell, I heard in a place where truckers don't usually stop for long. A roadside bar in southern Missouri. One of those places that seems to exist only because someone forgot to tear it down. Crooked sign, warm beer, and a counter that's heard too many confessions to stay in one piece. I was sitting in the back to the wall, old habit. That's when an old man approached. He didn't ask permission, didn't ask if he could sit. He just pulled up a chair like someone who had been there before, maybe in another life. He smelled of wet earth and rust, rough hands, cracked nails, eyes too pale for someone who lives avoiding the sun. "You look like the listening type," he said. I didn't answer. Someone who tells real stories doesn't care for those who talk too much. The old man ordered 2 drinks, paid before he even touched the glass. Then he began. He said that when he was a boy, he lived in a town too small to have an important name. One of those places where everyone knows each other, but nobody truly understands one another. The town had a strange custom. Every night, at exactly 11 o'clock, someone would walk down the main street, putting out the lights in the houses. It wasn't the mayor, it wasn't the police. It was a thin man, always in a hat, carrying a wooden pole with a hook at the end. He would knock once on the door. He'd wait, and then he'd turn the light out from the outside. Nobody complained. Nobody asked why. "It had been that way since before I was born," the old man said, slowly swirling his glass. "My father said it was better not to look out the window. My mother said that if the light was put out, the house was still safe." Safe, a dangerous word. One night, the old man, still a boy, forgot his bedroom light on. He was reading under the covers, hidden. He heard the knock, just one, dry, too polite. He didn't answer. Then he heard the hook scraping against the glass. The light went out. But before that, he swears he saw the man's face outside. He had no eyes. He had spaces where eyes usually go, too deep, like windows opening into something larger. He smiled,
a tired smile, almost sad. That night, the old man continued, nobody in my house slept, because even with the light out, someone kept walking through the rooms. Slow footsteps, too familiar, as if the house were being remembered by something else. The next day, the man in the hat didn't show up anymore. Never again. The people celebrated. They turned on the lights. They stayed up late. They said the town was free. 2 weeks later, they started finding empty houses. Table set, bed unmade, light bulbs burned out. The families hadn't left. They had been extinguished. The old man finished his drink and stood up. Some things aren't meant to protect us. They're just meant to warn us that there is still time. I asked where that town was. He smiled, just like the eyeless man, and replied, "Everywhere that forgets why it keeps the light on." He left. I never saw him again. But every time I pass through a small town at night, if I see someone walking the street after 11, I kill my headlights for a second. Not for fear, but for respect. Because the road teaches you one thing. Not every light was meant to stay lit forever. And some stories only exist to remind us of that.
Back road whisper.
There is a bell in Black Hollow that was never installed in any church, never marked any hour, and has never been seen swinging in the air. Yet some people swear they hear it ring, not loudly, not nearby, always distant, as if coming from a place that does not accept visitors. The detail no one can ignore is this: those who hear the bell only realize what it was announcing once it is already too late to change anything. Black Hollow is a small town in the hills of West Virginia, surrounded by slopes that muffle the wind and roads that seem deliberately confusing. It is the kind of place where sound travels strangely. A dog barking on the other side of the valley can sound like it's right behind you. A distant gunshot echoes as if it were fired too close. The people there don't trust coincidences much, but they also don't like naming what they don't understand. They prefer to say that certain things have always been that way. The bell was not part of the old stories. It didn't appear in local indigenous legends, nor was it linked to funerals, fires, or flood warnings. For decades, no one spoke of it because no one had a reason to, until the delays began. Margaret Lyle, a retired teacher, lost her husband on a road he had traveled his entire life. Jonah Reed, a farmer, arrived at his barn minutes after a fire had consumed everything. Pauline Mercer discovered a letter that was never opened, written years before a decision that changed her entire family. They didn't know each other well, but they had something in common. They all remembered hearing a bell before and ignoring it. The curious thing is that no one described the bell in the same way. Some said it was deep, almost like heavy metal being struck a single time. Others swore it was too high-pitched for a common bell. There were those who said it wasn't exactly a sound, but the sensation that a sound had just happened. The pattern wasn't in the hearing, it was in the timing. The bell never announced the event itself. It appeared before, just before. Enough time to be ignored, never enough time to be understood. And only a few people heard it. Parents didn't hear it when children did. Spouses didn't share the experience. It was something individual, isolated, intransferable. The bell didn't ask for attention. It allowed for choice.
There are warnings that do not serve to save, they serve to record. The Black Hollow bell did not function as an alarm, but as a marker, an invisible point in time where something could still be different, but only if the person was willing to act without understanding. The sound carried no instruction. It didn't say what, it didn't say how. It merely indicated that a fork in the road had just been crossed. And most disturbingly, the bell never repeated itself for the same person, for the same reason. Literally, distant sounds can be confused. Winds, old towers, machinery out of sight. But between the lines, the bell did not behave like a physical sound. It didn't echo, it didn't travel, it had no clear direction. In the human experience, this touches on an essential fear, the idea that there are decisive moments that do not announce themselves clearly, only with a strangeness that is far too easy to ignore. In practical life, everyone has experienced this. An unease before a wrong decision, a vague feeling before an avoided conversation, a premonition treated as nothing. The bell didn't force anything, it respected inertia. Over time, some people began to talk in low voices about the bell, not as a warning, but as a regret. Evan Brooks heard the bell before deciding not to call his brother that night. Clara Donnelly heard something metallic in the depths of the silence before signing a contract. Lewis Hart woke up with the sensation of a distant bell hours before losing control of his truck on a curve he knew well. None of them connected the sound to the event immediately. The connection only came later, always later. The town didn't panic, it just became quieter. People began to distrust moments of sudden silence. But distrusting did not mean acting, because acting without understanding is harder than being wrong with conviction. Literally, nothing proves the bell causes anything, but the emotional pattern is impossible to ignore. Those who hear the bell begin to live with the feeling of having failed at something that was never explained. Between the lines, the bell does not announce tragedies, it announces irreversibility. In the human experience, this is devastating because it suggests that the greatest weight in life comes not from what happens, but from what could have been avoided if only we had acted without certainty. The bell doesn't punish, it witnesses. Some compared the bell to that feeling of remembering something important too late, others to dreams that seem like warnings but only make sense afterwards. There were those who cited movies where characters ignore subtle signs and only recognize the point of no return once they have already crossed it. But the most recurring analogy was simple. Like seeing a yellow light and accelerating, believing there is still time. The bell doesn't scream, it relies on the delay. The bell is still heard in Black Hollow, rarely, always alone, never confirmed by another person at the same instant. Perhaps it doesn't exist as an object. Perhaps it never existed. Perhaps it is just the way the mind found to record the exact moment we chose not to act. The question that haunts those who have heard the bell is not why it rings. It is this: if you had a warning without instructions, without guarantees, without explanation, would you have the courage to obey? Because some things in life do not require certainty, they require movement. And the bell of Black Hollow seems to ring only for those who mistake silence for safety. Always only once, and always too late.
Backroad Whisper. There is a barn in the interior of Missouri where people claim to hear a sound that doesn't belong to any known animal, any old machine, or the wind slipping through warped wood. The strange thing isn't the sound itself. It's that no one can describe it the same way twice. And stranger still, no one changes immediately after hearing it. The change comes later, days later, sometimes months, as if something inside them had been subtly adjusted, shifted just enough to stay wrong. Hollow Creek County sits far from any major highway. It's a place of wide pastures, leaning fences, and abandoned silos that remain standing out of pure habit. People there don't rush. Most families have lived on the same land for so long that memory and landscape start to blur together. When something changes, it isn't announced, it's noticed. The barn stood on land owned by the Henderson family for nearly 80 years. First, it belonged to Walter Henderson, a quiet man known for working late and speaking only when necessary. Then it passed to Raymond Henderson, who kept everything exactly as it was, including the crooked barn, even when he could afford repairs. Finally, it went to Thomas Henderson, who inherited the property as an adult after his parents died and never seemed entirely comfortable with it. The barn sat downhill from the main house, in a part of the land where the air always felt colder. There was no history attached to it, no accidents, no deaths, no tragedy. For decades, it was just an old barn used to store tools, feed, and things no one remembered the reason for keeping. Until people started talking. At first, no one mentioned a sound directly. They said vague things, that it echoed strangely at night, that the silence around it felt heavier, that staying there too long made them uneasy. Nothing worth real attention, until the comments began to repeat. The first clearer account came from Martha Cole, who lived nearly a mile away. She said she heard something one night while passing near the barn under a moonless sky. She couldn't say whether it was a hum, a distant dragging noise, or a vibration in the air. Only that when she got home, she turned off the radio and didn't feel like listening to music anymore. Then there was Eugene Baker, who helped Thomas repair a nearby fence. Eugene mentioned casually that the barn had a background, not a noise, a constant presence, as if the air itself was occupied by something invisible. Over time, it became clear that the problem wasn't identifying the sound, it was what came after. Those who truly listened, not in passing, not distracted, began to change in small, difficult-to-name ways. Preferences faded, habits dissolved. Anxious people became too calm. Open-hearted people grew economical with words. No one lost their mind. No one broke down. They just became different. And nearly all of them had spent time alone inside the barn. There are stimuli that don't exist to inform, entertain, or warn. They exist to align. Just as certain sounds can induce sleep, anxiety, or focus, there are frequencies that communicate nothing at all. They simply reorganize. The sound in the barn had no clear beginning or end. It didn't rise or fall. It didn't respond to movement. It seemed to exist independently of anyone present, as if human attention was irrelevant to its continuation. The longer someone tried to understand it, the less they felt the urge to leave. Literally, an old barn could produce strange vibrations. Wood shifts, nails loosen, wind creates unexpected resonance. But beneath that explanation, the sound followed no physical logic. It didn't stop when everything was still. It didn't change with temperature.
It didn't vanish when the barn was empty. In human experience, this touches a quiet fear, the idea that something can alter us without confrontation, without pain, without warning. That deep change doesn't need violence. Persistence is enough. Everyone has felt something like that. A place that alters mood without explanation. An environment where thinking slowly changes before you realize it has. The barn never forced anything. It simply remained. Thomas Henderson began spending more time there once he became consciously aware of the sound. He told a neighbor that sleeping in the house felt misaligned. In the barn, he rested better, thought less, dreamed less. He didn't sleep there every night, only when he felt he needed to. Over time, Thomas started missing simple obligations, forgetting schedules, not out of confusion, but indifference. The house stayed clean, bills were paid, everything functioned, just without urgency. Then Thomas stopped appearing altogether. The property showed no signs of abandonment. Food in the refrigerator was fresh. The truck was still there. The barn was closed. And the sound, according to those who passed nearby, seemed easier to notice afterwards. Others began avoiding the place, but some still approached it. And those who approached it were the ones who changed the most. Literally, Thomas could have left. He could have chosen a different life. But the pattern remained. Those who listened long enough didn't lose sanity. What they lost was subtler. The need to be who they had been before. Beneath the surface, the sound didn't erase identity. It stripped excess, ambition, repetition, internal noise. That idea is unsettling, because it suggests that much of what we call the self may be interference, and that if that's removed, what remains isn't freedom, but silence. People tried to explain the feeling. Some compared it to staying too long in absolute quiet, others to hearing a continuous tone until the brain forgets it's there. Some mentioned films where characters hear something forbidden and no longer recognize their lives. But the most common comparison was simple. Like living for years in constant noise and only realizing how much it shaped you once the noise disappears. The barn never forced anything. It waited. The barn still stands in Hollow Creek, leaning, quiet, intact. The sound, according to a few, is still there. Not louder, not weaker, just constant. Maybe it isn't a warning. Maybe it isn't a threat. But maybe it's just an uncomfortable reminder that not everything that defines us came from within, and that if certain stimuli were removed, what remains might not be who we expected to be. The question no one in Hollow Creek asks out loud isn't what the sound is. It's this. If something could slowly remove the loudest parts of your identity, would you have the courage to find out what's left in their place? Because some changes don't arrive as impact, they arrive as fine adjustment. And by the time you notice, you're already too aligned to want to go back.
Backroad Whisper.
The kitten appeared on an ordinary morning, sitting in the middle of Maple Row, as if it had been placed there on purpose. It stayed a little over 3 weeks. But some people who lived on that street swear that certain things never stopped waiting for it after it disappeared. Maple Row lies on the outskirts of Elkwood, Tennessee, a town small enough that most people only pass through by mistake. The street itself is short, with 8 houses built before 1950, all of them old, all of them familiar with one another's sounds. It is not a street you cross, it is a street you end up on. The residents know footsteps by rhythm, doors by weight, and which lights turn on long after they should. That's why the kitten didn't go unnoticed. The first person to see it was Caleb Turner, a retired truck driver who opened his front door just after 6 in the morning. The kitten was sitting perfectly still in the road, staring at the house across from his, the one owned by Martha Collins. Caleb would later say he didn't feel pity. What he felt was discomfort. Not because the animal looked lost, but because it looked positioned, as if it knew exactly where it was supposed to be. Over the next few days, the kitten began appearing in different parts of the street, never running, never playing, always sitting. It showed up on the porch of Eleanor Price, directly beneath the window of her husband had died in years earlier. It sat behind the Whitman garage, below the room where their youngest child spoke to someone every night before falling asleep. It lingered near Jonah Mill's fence, close to a door no one had opened since his mother became ill. People started to talk, but not about the kitten itself. They talked about the feeling it brought with it. No one ever saw the kitten arrive. It was simply there, clean, quiet, watching. It never reacted to voices or movement. It didn't flinch. It was as if it was remembering something the houses had forgotten. In small communities, silence doesn't mean the absence of sound. It means accumulation. Unspoken words settle into walls. Delayed decisions cling to furniture. Unfinished grief drifts through rooms no one enters anymore. The kitten never crossed a threshold. It never stepped inside a home. It stayed outside, as if it wasn't allowed to go further than that. And yet, its presence alone was enough to make people notice things they had been ignoring for years. Literally, the kitten shouldn't have survived on its own. There wasn't enough trash, not enough shelter. But it never seemed weak. Between the lines, it acted like a point of focus. Wherever it appeared, something nearby stirred, not physically, but emotionally. In human experience, this is familiar. Certain presences enter our lives only to activate memories we thought were dormant. In practical terms, the discomfort never comes from the strange thing itself. It comes from what it makes impossible to keep ignoring. By the second week, reports began to circulate. Eleanor heard footsteps in her husband's room. Jonah found a chair moved closer to the door every morning. Martha started hearing faint scratching sounds coming from inside the walls at night. These weren't new noises, they were old ones resumed. Always after the kitten had been seen near that house during the day, and still the animal never made a sound. In Southern literature, animals are rarely just animals. They observe what was buried too early. Like in Edgar Allan Poe's stories, the unease doesn't come from the creature, but from what it forces into view. Like in Flannery O'Connor's work, the strange doesn't cause the tragedy, it reveals it. Even in everyday life, this happens. A brief visitor, an object out of place. They don't create the problem, they illuminate it. On the 22nd night, the kitten didn't appear. The next day, no one mentioned it. On the third day, someone asked. By the following week, everyone noticed. But the strangest part wasn't that it was gone, it was what remained. The houses felt attentive, as if something had been left unfinished. Doors creaked longer, silences stretched further.
It was as though the street had lost a reference point. Maybe the kitten never belonged to Maple Row. Maybe it belonged to what no one wanted to face. Some presences arrive only to maintain balance, not through force, but through observation. And when they leave, what they awakened doesn't go back to sleep. The question that still lingers on that street isn't where the kitten went. It's what enters your life quietly, reveals what was buried, and leaves before you realized it was the only thing keeping everything exactly where it was.
Back road whisper.
4 men swore they spent an entire night fishing in a quiet inlet of Ridgewater Lake. They described the water, the smell of damp soil, the way the moon reflected off the surface like dull metal. The next morning, they returned to the same spot. The water was still there, the shoreline was still there, but the place itself, whatever had allowed them to fish there, was gone. Ridgewater County sits deep in the interior of Arkansas, the kind of place where the land folds into itself slowly. Roads curve for no reason. Rivers widen, narrow, and change their minds. People there grow up learning that nature doesn't always explain itself, but it usually stays put. That's why this story unsettled the locals, not because something appeared, but because something allowed itself to be found and then refused to exist again. The men were Harold Boone, who ran the hardware store near Main Street, Eli Watkins, a former park ranger who knew the woods better than most people knew their own homes, Noah Pierce, a mechanic whose hands always smelled faintly of oil, and Samuel Crow, who lived closest to the lake and had fished it longer than anyone else. These weren't reckless men, they were routine men, the kind who did the same things the same way year after year.
The trail starts here.
The idea for a night fishing trip didn't come out of nowhere, but it didn't come from habit either. Samuel mentioned a spot he'd come across a few evenings earlier, a quiet recess of the lake, still water, no current. He said the fish there didn't behave normally. He didn't elaborate, and none of the others pressed him. In Ridgewater, vague invitations were often accepted without questions. People trusted familiarity more than clarity. They met just before dusk. The truck rolled down a narrow dirt road with no sign, no marker, nothing to suggest it led anywhere important. When they reached the water, the first thing Eli noticed was the silence. No insects, no frogs, no night birds. The lake sat there like it was holding something in. The shoreline felt wrong in a way that none of them could immediately describe. The ground was firm, but left no clear footprints. The air smelled clean, almost filtered. Harold later said it reminded him of standing inside an empty church after everyone had left. They cast their lines. The fish came quickly, too quickly. Large, heavy shapes pulled against the rods with a strength that didn't match the calm surface of the water. When the fish broke the surface, their bodies were dark, almost absorbing the moonlight instead of reflecting it. No one commented on it. They unhooked, rebaited, and cast again. Conversation faded without anyone deciding to stop talking. Time behaved strangely. At one point, Noah checked his watch and realized it had stopped. When he tapped it, it started again, but he couldn't say how long it had been frozen. None of them felt tired. None of them felt excited either. They were simply there, doing what the place seemed to want them to do. What they didn't do was look across the water. Later, each man would admit that the thought crossed his mind, and that each time something subtle urged him not to. Not fear, not warning, just a quiet certainty that there was nothing useful in that direction. They left just before dawn, though none of them remembered deciding to. The fish were loaded into coolers. The truck started on the first try.
As they drove away, Samuel glanced back once and immediately wished he hadn't, though he couldn't explain why. They agreed to return the next night. In daylight, the road ended early. Where the truck had driven before, there was now dense brush and uneven ground. They walked, spreading out, searching for familiar landmarks. Eli looked for a bent tree he distinctly remembered near the waterline. It wasn't there. The shoreline curved differently. The lake looked flatter, like something had been smoothed over. Harold said it out loud first. The sentence came out slow, careful. The water's still here, but the place isn't. They searched for hours. No tire tracks, no disturbed soil, no sign that 4 men had stood there all night fishing. Samuel grew agitated, then quiet. Eli stopped offering explanations. Noah suggested they were misremembering, but even he didn't sound convinced. Over the next few days, the fish began to rot unnaturally fast. The smell clung to their hands no matter how much they washed. Flies avoided the remains. Samuel returned alone one night and came back empty-handed, shaken, unable to describe where he'd gone. After that, small things changed. Eli started sleeping with a light on. Harold stopped selling fishing gear. Noah avoided driving near the lake altogether. They didn't argue about what happened. They didn't try to solve it. They simply adjusted, the way people do after realizing that something in the world has quietly revised the rules. Some places aren't meant to be visited, others aren't meant to be revisited, and a rare few only exist long enough to be remembered, like a door that closes the moment you realize you've stepped through it. The men of Ridgewater never asked where the fishing spot went. The real questions stayed unspoken, heavier than curiosity. How many moments in a person's life are only safe the first time? And what happens when you try to return to something that was never meant to stay open? Because not every place disappears. Some simply decide you've already been there long enough.
Back road whisper.
In the town of Briar Hollow, tucked deep into the hills of West Virginia, there was a habit passed from father to son in the Grayson family that no one ever explained. Locals said every man in that bloodline learned it before turning 12. They also said no one who stopped ever spoke clearly about why they started again. Briar Hollow was the kind of place where old rules survived longer than people. A former mining town, surrounded by dense forest and roads swallowed by fog, it carried a silence that felt practiced. The story begins with Earl Grayson, a widower and lifelong logger, known for being careful in ways that went beyond common sense. Every night, without exception, Earl performed the same action before going to bed. He would open the back door of the house, step outside exactly 2 steps, pause for several seconds, and then wipe the soles of his boots against the bare ground. Sometimes the boots were muddy, sometimes they were clean. That never changed the routine. Only after wiping them would he step back inside, close the door, lock it, and turn off the lights. Neighbors noticed it over the years, but never asked. In Briar Hollow, questions had a way of lingering longer than answers. When Earl's son, Thomas Grayson, turned 12, his father called him to the back door one night. Earl didn't sit him down, didn't explain anything. He only pointed towards the threshold and said, "Now you do it too." Thomas copied the motion without understanding it. 2 steps outside, pause, wipe the soles, back inside. That was the entire lesson. No story followed, no warning, but from that night on, Thomas never skipped it.
Years later, when a friend once asked why he did such a strange thing, Thomas answered without thinking, "Because if I don't, I bring something inside." He didn't say what that something was, not an animal, not dirt, not cold air, just something. That word hung in the air heavier than any explanation. The habit wasn't really about boots or doors, it was about the space in between, the threshold, the invisible line separating outside from inside. In places like Briar Hollow, people believed a house wasn't safe because it was closed. It was safe because certain things never crossed that line. And those things were never named. Naming them felt like an invitation. The habit functioned like a procedure, not a superstition. The way you double-check a lock, the way you turn off a stove even when you're sure it's already off. You don't question it, you just do it. Because the mistake doesn't punish you immediately, it waits. Literally, the act of wiping the soles seemed meaningless. Earl even did it on days he never left the house, which meant it was never about what was on the boots. It was about acknowledging something on the other side of the door and making sure it stayed there. Between the lines, the gesture felt like a quiet agreement, a wordless exchange. You stay where you are, I stay where I am. Not a banishment, but a boundary. Like something standing patiently outside, not forcing its way in, just waiting to be carried across. Many people carry habits like this without knowing why. Certain doors always locked, certain paths never taken, certain gestures repeated exactly as thought. Not because they believe, but because someone before them believed on their behalf. When a habit survives generations without explanation, it stops being a choice. It becomes a responsibility. And old responsibilities usually exist to contain old things. Stories like this echo through films and folklore. In The Witch, the horror comes not from the creature, but from the breaking of order. In rural towns, some barns are never entered at night, not because of sounds, but because the silence inside feels wrong. Even removing shoes before entering a home isn't always about cleanliness. It's about respecting a boundary. Earl Grayson died without explaining the habit. Thomas continued it, and when he had a son of his own, he taught it the same way. No context, no reasoning, just the motion. Today, the Grayson house stands abandoned. The back door hangs loose, the lock long broken. Some residents say that on fog-heavy nights, boot prints appear on the kitchen floor, not leading in, leading out, which leaves the most unsettling thought of all. Maybe the habit was never meant to keep something from entering the house, but to make sure something never left its place.